Hi everyone, my name is Mike, and this video is on the Windows Subsystem for Linux. So this video actually follows along with a guide that I created. You can find that guide at github.com/michaeltreat, and under my pinned repositories is a link to that guide. I'll also add this guide, a link to this guide in the video's description as well. So this video is part one of a three-part series, and this video in particular is really going to be very informational. So starting from the second video and the third video, we're going to talk about, that's where we're actually going to talk about the setups, and we're going to follow this guide step by step. This is a brand new laptop, so I haven't set up the Windows Subsystem here, so you'll be able to see what it looks like to set it up just like you would for the first time. Again, that's in videos 2 and 3. This video in particular is really going to be an overview of what WSL is, why it's important, why it's powerful, and also it's going to talk about how we work with the WSL feature. The WSL feature is kind of unique. The workflow, at least, is kind of unique, and the concepts we use may not be familiar to you, as there are some caveats to how this system works. So before I dive into it, I want to throw out a couple disclaimers. I'm the only set of eyes on this thing. I made this about 3 or 4 months ago, and this is a setup that I've used since fall of 2017. And I personally have not run into any issues. I've set this up about 3 or 4 times on different laptops, and I haven't run into any issues, but some of my students have. So if you have any issues, please make an issue here on the repo or send me an email. You can find my email on my GitHub repo page. You can also find me on LinkedIn. Also add a comment to the comment section. And the more information you can, the better. I haven't been able to recreate any of the issues that some of my students have, so I don't know what's caused them. But as much information as you can give me, the better. I'll also be watching this video really closely, the comment section at least, for at least the next 6 months. After that point, I'll probably be remaking this video and updating the guide to include any new features that WSL has put out. But until then, add comments to the comment section. I'll keep an eye on them. Any issues you have, like I said, give me as much information as you can, and I will get to them as soon as I come across them. Also, one last thing, this guide is really geared towards web development. So if you are doing something other than web development, I don't know how applicable this may be to you, but about the first 5 or 6 minutes of the second video, you will have if you do follow along with that video, you'll have WSL set up on your machine, and at that point you can do pretty much whatever you want. At that point it is set up. The rest of the video and all of video 3 are just going to be additional information and really go a little bit more in depth into some examples to show you how I work with it. But if you are doing something other than web development, first 5 or 6 minutes of the second video will get this entire Windows Subsystem for Linux completely set up on your machine. Other than that, let's dive in. So here is the main repo that we're going to be following. The guide that we're going to be following. It is on this repo. And like I mentioned about issues, please add any issues you have. Anything that you come across, send me an email, send me a comment, add an issue. I will get to them as soon as I can, close them, try and knock them off as soon as they come up. Other than that, when you hear me talk about Ubuntu, so this guide uses the Ubuntu distribution for the Linux Ubuntu distribution. I'm using Ubuntu because that is what I'm familiar with, and that is what the people at my school, the staff at my school have used as well. So I use Ubuntu, but know that any distribution that you want to use, whether it's Arch, Fedora, whichever distribution you use, they would all work fine with some minor tweaks. The high-level concepts and the workflow are all going to be the same, but some of the commands may change depending on which distribution you're using. Also note that when I mention Ubuntu, I'm pretty much always referring to the subsystem. So The subsystem, we'll talk more about what the Windows subsystem is, but the subsystem is basically referring to whichever distribution that you're using. So, and you can have multiple distributions as well, but we're not going to cover that. But when you hear me talk about Ubuntu, I'm talking about the Windows subsystem. Awesome. So this guide has a folder and 2 files, and this image here that you're seeing is the README file, and it is the introduction into the guide. Other than that, this is the license, and then we have a folder for READMEs. In the READMEs, it contains all the pages of the guide, and it also contains this extra folder called installs. And all this is just 2 installations for a Mongo database and a Postgres database, just to give you some extra information about what it looks like to actually set this up using this system. It's also there because the students that I work with will at some point, if they decide to go through the JavaScript track, will be using Mongo and Postgres, so it seemed to make sense to make one of these guides as well for them. Other than that, let's dive into so that pretty much covers up the repo, so we can start diving into the guide. So this README up here, it's just a quick intro and an overview and an explanation of what the guide covers. So what we're going to talk about in this video is we're actually going to talk about steps 1 and steps 3. This is the information that I want to talk about, is what WSL is, why it's important, and about the 2 file systems and how they work together. Steps 2, 4, 5, and 6 are all going to be contained in videos 2 and 3. And that's where I'll be doing the step-by-step video guide, or the step-by-step video walkthrough of this guide. And then below that is where the actual guide starts. Below that is all the upcoming editions and any credits that we have. I want to give a shout out to Izzy. She's an awesome software developer, and she gave me a huge hand in editing this guide. I really suck at grammar, and she did a great job with that. So really appreciate that. This section here will be all the upcoming editions. This is all what I'm trying to get added in this month in July. Other than that, let's dive into the guide. Awesome. So this is the first page of the guide, and what this is really just an overview of what WSL is, an overview of the workflow, and a summary of basically everything we covered. And then this will take us to this link at the bottom. Will take us to the very first step of actually setting up. We're going to skip this step, and we're going to go to the third doc, but video 2 will go through this step right here. Awesome. So what is WSL? What is the Windows Subsystem for Linux? So the Windows Subsystem for Linux is kind of what it sounds like, right? It's a subsystem on Windows that allows you to run Linux. But that's not enough, right? So what WSL is a Windows feature that came out on Windows, that's available on Windows 10. And what it does is allows you to have a truly native POSIX Unix-like environment on your Windows machine. Now, in the past, there have been some other solutions to this problem of, how do you run POSIX software on Windows? Right? There's been different solutions. You have like console wrappers like Git Bash. You have emulators or virtual machines. Or sometimes people, what they would do is dual boot. So they'll run Windows on part of their file on their hard drive, and the other part of their hard drive is going to be for Ubuntu or some other Linux distro, right? But the problem with a dual boot is that your 2 file systems are connected. If you want to be on Windows, you have to go to Windows. Not 100% true, but kind of true. You are basically booting up one OS over the other one. That's what a dual boot is. I personally, at least in my background, I've gone through Windows development using Git Bash. I've done a dual boot, web development on Windows using Git Bash. I've done a dual boot, so I used Ubuntu, and I've also developed for web on Mac. So I'm familiar with probably what I would consider maybe the 3 main OSs that people use. But the power of WSL, and what WSL does is it allows Windows, which is not a POSIX environment, to have a native POSIX environment directly connected to the Windows file system. So that means you have files living on your Windows file system and under your C drive or D drive, whichever hard drive you're using. You have those files living there, and Ubuntu or whichever subsystem that you decide to use can reach into your Windows file system and grab those files and use them on its file system, and vice versa. Windows can also look into the Ubuntu file system at those files as well. Now, there's a couple caveats with that, which we'll explain later, but that pretty much covers what WSL is, but we don't really ask why do we need it, right? At least in my experience with web development, sometimes there's software out there that is designed solely for POSIX environments or Unix or Linux environments, or something that other than Windows, the Windows environment. Another big reason is that a lot of the servers on the web are running in POSIX environments. And the commands that live in a POSIX environment, they don't always translate over into Windows. So while we might have equivalent commands, it's, for all intents and purposes, you consider it almost two different languages. And sometimes there are commands in a POSIX environment, POSIX commands, that don't translate over into Windows. So that leaves really software developers a couple options, which you've probably seen them. If you go online and you decide to download a piece of software, you will see that it says choose your OS, choose Mac or Linux or Windows, 32-bit, 64-bit, so on and so forth. So what happens is these software developers will make specific releases of their software for specific OSs, but sometimes it's not available to you. The other thing is sometimes as a software developer, you may have a piece of software that you want to use, but there are other pieces of software that you want to use with it that those extra pieces are only designed to run in POSIX environments, so they don't work with your Windows version, things like that. So the reason, back to the main question of why is this powerful? This is powerful because you are essentially getting all of the power of a Windows machine and all the power of a POSIX machine all in one. You're getting the best of both worlds. The problem it solves is being able to run software and tools that you couldn't run otherwise. So that's awesome. That's something that's been a feature that people have been looking for a long time, and there have been many solutions like I talked about with emulators, VMs, console wrappers, so on and so forth. This is a true solution engineered by Windows as a Windows feature. So it's awesome. I'm excited. I'm excited to share this. I've been using it, like I said, since fall of 2017, and I have not run into any issues using this software since I've been using WSL feature. So that covers what WSL is. That covers why WSL is, or why WSL is important. And now we need to talk about a couple of the caveats. So this is really what I want to talk about most, at least the majority of the rest of the video, are these two caveats right here. So the first one is it says, the subsystem does not have access to a GUI, so it cannot run any programs that need one, like a browser or an editor. It's strictly a command line. So what that means is just what it says. If you were to use the Ubuntu, if you were to use Ubuntu or some other distro, you would have a UI just like we have here. Ubuntu has a bar that goes up along the side, or however you want to set it up. You don't get access to any of that. You really just get a command line. You just get a command line. Now, this is not entirely true. I have seen that the WSL feature and whichever subsystem you're using does, in a way, have access to it. But every guide I've seen for how you do this and how you get this set up has always been buggy. I haven't actually seen it work 100% with smoothly. So at least in our workflow, we just assume that we don't have access to a GUI. The nice thing here is that our workflow allows us to do that. We really don't need a GUI anyways, even if we did have access to it. Really, the only thing we want this subsystem for and I'll show it down here. There's a link to it. All we really want this subsystem for are two things. We use the subsystem to install and run our programs, and to give us a shell that allows us to issue Unix-like commands in our Windows file system. So that's really all we use the subsystem for anyways. Again, if you're not doing web development, I don't know exactly what you may need out of the subsystem, so that may not apply to you, but at least in web development, really the only thing we need is some POSIX environment to run our software in. So that pretty much covers step one, or caveat one, I should say. Caveat two is what I really want to spend the most time on. It's also kind of confusing to explain, so I'm going to do my best, but if I'm not doing a good job explaining it or you're not understanding it, just bear with me. It's totally fine if you don't understand it 100% at this point. Videos 2 and 3 will show what this caveat is talking about a lot better than any way that I could explain it. But I'm going to do my best right here without diving too deep into it. So basically what this is saying is you cannot edit the subsystem's files through Windows or any Windows apps. The subsystem can edit both Windows and its own files just fine though. So what this means is that, like I said, you have two file systems. You'll have a Windows file system and an Ubuntu or a subsystem file system. And what happens is these two file systems are actually mounted together. So you'll have a Windows file system here, and it has a path that leads to the Ubuntu file system. And the Ubuntu file system also has its own path that leads to the Windows file system. So they're mounted together. They're actually connected together. The problem is that if you were to open up a text editor on your Windows file system, it's a piece of software that lives on your Windows file system, and you try to navigate into the Ubuntu file system and edit one of those files using the text editor from Windows, it'll break. And the two main reasons are, one is it has to do with permissions. Most likely, if you were to try to do that, if you were to try to edit a subsystem file through Windows or any of its apps, what would happen is you'll most likely get a permission denied. You won't be able to get past permissions to do it. And if you do, there are some guides to show you how to work around that. I don't recommend it because we don't need to do that at all, and it's messy. If you do, however, get past that point, the other issue is that it would end up corrupting that file anyways. In most majority of the cases, it would corrupt that file that lives on the subsystem. So really, from the Windows side, Windows and Windows apps can only read subsystem files, but they can't edit them. And what I mean by edit is you can't create them, you can't update them, and you can't delete them. So if you delete them, you'll see it's a weird bug. It'll show up as deleted on your Windows file system, but not deleted on the Ubuntu file system. So this is addressed in the workflow. So our workflow will this seems like a major issue, right? But our workflow works around this issue, and it actually becomes very smooth and makes a lot of sense. Now, on the flip side, the subsystem, however, it can edit its own files and Windows files. So if you're on the Ubuntu file system and you have a piece of software running on that file system, and that software wanted to update a Windows file, it could do that just fine. There's no permission error, there's no corruption error, or anything like that. So that is one major caveat that I feel a lot of my students had a hard time grasping, at least the ones I worked with most recently, because they switched to the system in the middle of their courses. In between two courses, they switched. So it's a little bit of a curveball, and it's not a common concept to be able to do, or that you've encountered, right? But anyways, enough on that. The next videos will explain that in a little bit more detail, along with visual examples from the terminals, so you can actually see what I'm talking about when this caveat comes up. Awesome. So let's do a quick explanation of the workflow. Like I said, the fact that you can't edit the subsystem's files through Windows or Windows apps might be a huge problem, but it's really not because of the workflow. since we are only using the subsystem to install and run our programs, and to give us a shell to issue Unix-like commands, that means that 90% or more of your web or of your actual development process is going to be done on the Windows side. And you're only ever going to use the Ubuntu subsystem when you need this software or these tools that come with the command line. That's the only time you're going to use the Ubuntu software. Excuse me. That's the only time you're going to use the subsystem. So a typical workflow is open up whichever Linux distro you're using, which is just like open up a terminal window. You work normally doing everything on the Windows file system, and I'll explain what this means, doing everything on the Windows file system. This implies that you can also do things on the Ubuntu file system, which is true, but I'll explain what that means in the next videos. Then for 3, when you need new software, you navigate to the subsystems file system. You install that program through the command line. And the reason we do it through the command line is because we assume we don't have access to a GUI, and we really don't. And the way that we want to do this, assume at this point that we don't. When that feature is implemented and it's bug-free, or at least vastly majority bug-free, I will update this guide. For now, assume that you're going to be installing things through the command line on the subsystem. 4, you navigate back to the Windows file system and just use the software as needed. The nice thing is, since the software is connected to the path, it runs just fine. What this means is that even though you've installed some software on your subsystem, like Ubuntu or whatever, and you go back to the Windows file system, the paths between those two things are connected, and they do a great job of connecting those things. So if I'm on the Windows file system and I want to start my Mongo service, if I type mongod, it knows what I'm talking about. It knows to look at the window at the Ubuntu or the subsystem file system and run that service. And that service is actually going to be running in a POSIX environment since it's on that subsystem's file system. So that's the power. That's where the power comes in. So this last section is a summary. I'm going to skip that. Feel free to read that on your own time. This next page where it says setting up WSL, we're going to go here, but we're going to skip this. This will be part of video 2. This is where we first start installing things. So we're going to skip this, and we're going to go to step 3. This talks about learning the file systems. So we're on 3, understanding the file systems. And this really goes a little bit more in depth about what I'm talking about with caveat 2. So again, we have these 2 file systems. They're mounted together. We have the Windows file system and the Ubuntu file system, or whatever distro you're using. And I'm going to go through this again probably at the end of video 2 to show you what these. There are some steps here just so you can see where things are connected. But what this section goes into depth about is basically pretty much actually everything I talked about earlier, just a little bit more in depth. Let me see. I don't think there's anything that I didn't cover that I should mention right now. Yeah. So the only thing I would mention, nope, I'll save that for the end of the second video. So this looks great. So at this point, I'm pretty sure that this is all the information that I wanted to give you at this point. So yeah, this will be the end of the video. The next video, we're going to go through the second guide, and we're actually going to get set up on WSL and the Ubuntu app. And the nice thing is, probably by the end of the first 5 or 6 minutes, once this page is done here, you have WSL set up on your machine. And if you ignored the rest of the videos, but you watched this one in the first 5 minutes, you would still know enough to be able to go and develop stuff by yourself. The rest of the guides after that first 5 or 6 minutes, the rest of the videos are really going to be in depth about some examples, some different scenarios, and they're also there to help any of the students that are watching this video get set up with some of the pre-work that at least at current are going on in the school, that the school I have gone to is using. Excuse me, that was hard to say. But yeah, so this is the end of the video. Like I said, if you have any questions, comments, suggestions, if I made too many mistakes or whatever, you want me to remake the video, let me know. I'm down for anything. Send me an email, make an issue, connect with me on LinkedIn. Otherwise, thanks again. Appreciate it.